Welcome to Talking Money, episode 7. Hannah, good to see you again. We've got 3 really great subjects to talk about this week, personal finance news stories, things going on. We're going to start off with some criticism that the Bank of England's faced around its support for, I guess we could call them dirty businesses, but carbon-intensive businesses. So this committee of MPs, the Environmental Audit Committee, has written to the bank's governor and said, basically, you've got to stop giving so much financial support to these polluting companies. What did you make of that one?
I think it's actually a tricky one, which I know it sounds like a surprise for me because, of course, I'm pro doing everything we can to kind of bring our carbon footprint down. To my understanding, the MPs are focusing on 2 forms of finance in particular. So there's COVID emergency funding, and there's this kind of long-term corporate bond funding. Now, this goes beyond my understanding of economics. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, but I would have thought this long-term corporate bond funding is a more kind of standard practice. In which case, I would say it's completely reasonable that the bank asks that whoever it is that they're funding disclose their climate-related activities. I would actually go one step further, and I would say if the bank is going to fund something like that, being that this is taxpayer money, they actually have to not just disclose, but also set targets that is going to bring down their carbon footprint. I keep wanting to say corporate footprint for some reason.
The 2 are probably quite closely linked, actually. If you have a big corporate footprint, you've probably got a big climate footprint as well, carbon footprint as well. But you're right, it's in these 2 parts. On the emergency support that the bank seems to be giving businesses, again, it's taxpayer money, but they apparently have supported 230 large companies. Some of them are household names, and I guess businesses that we take for granted, but really do have a big impact on the environment. So the airlines, for example, British Airways and its owner, I think it's IAG Group, EasyJet, for example, then car manufacturers, Rolls-Royce, who produce lots of aircraft engines. So these are some of the big companies who have been receiving taxpayer money to get them through the COVID emergency, but actually they're probably quite big contributors to climate change.
But yeah, I mean, that's the problem, really, isn't it? But being that it is COVID emergency funding, I'm slightly more sympathetic, I suppose, to the cause, because I think in the grand scheme of things, it's more important to keep these businesses afloat, keep people in work where possible, than it is to sort of worry about their carbon footprint at this particular point. But I'm quite happy that the MPs are pushing the Bank of England, at least in this way, because we all do need to do more. And I think often it does have to start from sort of a higher place. And if the bank can push this through businesses that it funds, I can only see it being a good thing in the long run.
And I guess all of us are going to have to find this right balance between protecting the environment, between reducing climate change, but also, as you say, protecting jobs, because it's the easiest way to stop climate change or man-made climate change would be to halt all economic growth and activity. But clearly, that's a bad outcome for millions of people. We're already seeing unemployment shooting up. We've had the latest figures this week showing a significant rise in unemployment. But all of a sudden, you cut off funding to the airlines, to car manufacturers, to other businesses which are carbon intensive, and that's a horror story for the economy, for jobs, for people's incomes, for families. So I mean, finding that balance seems to be really tricky.
I agree. I completely agree. And we are in unprecedented times, as I keep hearing and everybody keeps saying. So for once, I would say actually what we need to do is just prioritize jobs and prioritize businesses getting through, because you can't have however many people unemployed. I mean, like you said, the unemployment rate's going to go up. It will go up even more as these various schemes sort of stop. Almost giving people zombie jobs, jobs that just don't really exist, and these zombie businesses that don't really exist anymore, that will fail when the government funding stops. So I think that is on our list of problems, that is currently number 1. That's not to say that we forget about climate change and we pretend it's not happening. But I think if we can't have both perfectly at the same time that we're dealing with them. We have to deal with the job problem first.
You've got to pick one or the other, absolutely. I mean, longer term, probably medium term, I think this whole theme of environmental, social, and corporate governance investing, ESG investing, it's the only viable future. And we're seeing such a big political agenda worldwide. I mean, Joe Biden becoming president last week, and immediately first act as president, re-entering the Paris Climate Change Accord. So there's a huge political drive, and we hear this term "build back better." So I think all governments around the world, it's not just a UK thing, but all governments, and we talked before about this, we talked about the ban on petrol and diesel engine cars, new car sales from 2030. Clearly the UK has got its presidency this year of I'll get this right, the G7, I think it is. So it's a big part of their agenda as their presidency of the G7 this year. So it's inevitable that we're going to see a huge amount more of focus on this ESG investment approach. But you're right, short term, prioritizing jobs, prioritizing livelihoods has got to be the answer.
It has, and I think as well, there's a lot of people that are, I think, maybe a little bit skeptical about ESG investing, and I can understand that to an extent, because I think this is a term that's been around since before I was born in one form or another. And there's also a certain amount of now greenwashing and it being quite fashionable to be a sustainable business. And actually, if you look into the details, a lot of these businesses aren't very sustainable or have a terrible corporate governance structure. I know in fast fashion, which when you think about it is quite obvious. If we in the West can buy a T-shirt for £4 from a high street shop, there's got to be somewhere along the line that corporate governance is out of whack. Somebody is being taken advantage of along the labor chain, probably several people.
Yeah.
But I think ESG this time is here to stay. And I agree that I think it's the future, actually, because there's a lot of regulatory change now that's coming from the powers that be, that are making it very, very attractive and very necessary for business to move in this more sustainable direction, which suggests to me that businesses that do it well are the ones that really have a future and are going to thrive in a world where we are more, hopefully, we are all more conscious about our carbon footprint and actually what damage we're doing to the planet. So I think everybody needs to get on board with ESG investing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're quite right there as well. It's got to be done by people that walk the walk and don't just talk the talk, because it's too easy just to throw platitudes at this thing and greenwash, as you say. It's far too easy. Actually, look for businesses that are doing it properly, and that's probably the future. Our second story we're going to talk about this week then is a change to the self-assessment deadline. Do you fall under self-assessment, Hannah, or are you going to in the future?
Yeah, well, just about. This is the first time I've ever done it this year. And you know what? Like sod's law, it was the beginning of last week, I believe. And it suddenly occurred to me, oh my God, it's nearly the end of January and I haven't done my self-assessment. I've never done it before. I'd been kind of quite organized about it. So I'd already got my number that you need to log in from HMRC. So I'd got everything I needed to go. I had my invoices in a file on my computer. So I was quite organized, but I'd never actually done the process. And so I stressed myself out thinking, oh my God, this deadline's around the corner. I've got to do it. Did it. And then only, yesterday, they've now said that people that do have to fill out these self-assessment forms now have until the end of February. So I needn't have stressed too much.
You say that, but I think it's probably a good thing. I mean, the deadline has changed. So the deadline for self-assessment usually is 31st of January, and the government has changed it to 28th of February because they recognise we're all stressed, we're all under pressure to get things done, and actually, tax administration and things is probably quite low down the list if we're trying to homeschool the kids and just trying to stay afloat at the moment. So they've given us that pushback. However, I would suggest to people, don't use that extension. And my reason is this. So doing your self-assessment accurately calculates how much tax you have to pay. And if you haven't submitted your self-assessment, you don't know how much tax you're going to have to pay on the 31st of January. So they've extended the self-assessment date, but they've not changed the payment date. So you've still got to pay your self-assessment by the end of this week, by Sunday. So there's that one thing. They're not fining people. Usually if you're late with your payment, there's a £100 fine. They've waived the fine, but they are still charging interest on late payments. So that's one thing. And then the other, I don't know for sure on this one, but I would caution people, if they're thinking of using the extension, to make sure they still get it in on time. And that's previously, things like the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme has been predicated, qualification for that's been predicated on having submitted your self-assessment on time. So if you're worried about not qualifying for grants and government support in the future, using that holiday or even missing that new deadline of 28th of Feb is probably not a good thing. So even though there's an extension, no one's doing anything this weekend anyway. You may as well stay in and do your self-assessment.
Exactly. What better way to spend time than doing a self-assessment form? But no, I completely agree, and that's what is important for people to know, really, that you still really have to pay the tax from the beginning of February, and you won't know what it is unless you do the self-assessment. It is only a tiny amount of interest. It realistically is not going to be a big problem to anybody. It's going to be smaller than the fine in 9.5 out of 10 cases. But still, I think it's best just to get it done. But what I will say is this, despite there's clearly a flaw here, and I don't know actually why government didn't just decide, okay, well, let's push the date when people actually have to pay their tax back. But for whatever reason, they decided against it. But despite that, this has been met with a lot of positivity. And it's the self-employed. I mean, they have had grants and things like that from the government this year to help them out, but there's been an awful lot of people that have fallen through those cracks. And while this certainly doesn't make up to those 3 million people that for whatever reason haven't had any government support, there's a whole variety of reasons why you might have fallen through the cracks. It shows that government is on some level listening to the plight of the self-employed and recognize that there are difficulties, and this is just not a priority for a lot of people right now that, like you say, are trying to homeschool kids.
Yeah, I mean, the reason they've not pushed the payment date back is they need the money. And government public finances are so reliant on that 31st of January influx of self-assessment payments that the finance figures would look awful if they pushed that back and got paid later. I think my message is really get it done. You're right, there has been lots of support for people, particularly self-employed people. The payment on account last July, for example, you could defer till this month. So for a lot of people who are under the self-assessment system, if they deferred that previous payment last summer, they're going to have a big tax bill due at the end of this month. However, the other reason for getting your self-assessment in is if you do it within, I think, 60 days of the deadline, you can apply for a payment plan with HMRC. And again, it's spread over 12 months. It's a very low rate of interest. If you don't do it within 60 days, there's a 5% surcharge added to that payment plan. So, that becomes, again, that can be, it's not a small amount of interest or £100 fine. That can be quite a lot of money. I always leave paying mine to the last minute, so I'm going to be paying mine on Friday. It's a scary number this year, but I can't quibble too much about that because it's a tax of success, I guess, isn't it? The more you pay in tax, the better you've done that year. It never feels good paying the tax man big sums of money for self-assessment. You'll have this to come. I've been doing it for 20 plus years now. I don't know anything else other than the self-assessment system, and it's some years not very much fun. Moving on to that one, and probably inappropriately as well, because we're now talking about inequality and wealth inequality. So I'm whinging about my big tax bill. Nowhere near the scale of what Oxfam have identified, and they're talking about this report, the inequality virus, where I think it was the 1,000 richest in the world managing to recoup their losses from the economic impact of COVID within 9 months. But the poorest people in the world, it's going to take a decade to bring these losses back. So did you see the report? What did you think of some of the findings from Oxfam?
I have to say I was really not surprised by any of the findings. The standout finding for me was that the 10 richest men in the world, and their names that people recognize, like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, they are $500 billion richer now since the COVID-19 pandemic began. And some of those I think are more surprising than others. Jeff Bezos, obviously the founder of Amazon, that is so unsurprising to me, that Amazon, the business that is online and that has been very innovative in the way that it works, as in this Amazon Prime, you are pretty much guaranteed to get something the next day. When everybody is staying home during a pandemic, it makes complete sense that business would do very, very well. Elon Musk with Tesla, a little bit more surprising. That's actually largely because of share prices shooting up. So that's more interesting in itself. But we have talked about before that this has been a pandemic of two halves, and nowhere is that more clear than in the 0.01%, 0.00001%, or however many noughts you need in there to have these people sort of looked at. But it's a sad state of affairs, and I know we're going to talk about this, so I'll just bring it up. I do think there should be a tax on that wealth that those individuals have made, and actually Oxfam as well said, this is a quote directly from Oxfam: a temporary tax on excess profits made by the 32 global corporations that have gained the most during the pandemic could have raised 104 billion in 2020. This is enough to provide unemployment benefits for all workers and financial support for all children and elderly people in low and middle income countries. Now, I can't think of many better things to do with 104 billion, to be perfectly honest. And these corporations have clearly done incredibly well. And it feels fair that in a time when so many people have struggled, they've lost their jobs, they've been living hand to mouth, they've had to use food banks and things like that in some circumstances, that the very wealthy and those that have done very well from this pandemic should pay their fair share.
Yeah, I mean, Oxfam refer to this as a rigged economic system. So, this is a cut-in report. They said 87% of economists they spoke to globally believe that, inequality will rise to a certain extent or very much so as a result of this pandemic, so income inequality. And they point out there's no recession for the richest. So, whilst most of us, and I think it's the majority of people we'd categorise as not within the richest. So you say it's the 0.001%. It's not the 1%. This is a tiny subset of those. Most of us are experiencing a recession in some form or some shape, but for the richest in the world, there is no recession. Actually, it's an opportunity for them to have made money. And they point out different groups. So women hit hardest by this pandemic and income inequality as usual. The cost of lives from inequality, so those countries with greater levels of income inequality, in some cases 40% more likely to die from COVID if you're part of that group. And they also pointed out that fairer societies, when it comes to income inequality, have had a faster recovery from the economic impacts of COVID. So some really powerful findings in here. I think bringing it down to a sort of individual level, I think the lesson we can learn from this, if anything, is, well, firstly, don't ever rely on governments to put you in the right position. But the reason these richest are recovering quickly from the pandemic, from the recession, is because they own assets. They own investments, they own businesses, they own property. And actually the way, it says, it's too simple just to say, isn't it? But the way to overcome recessions and to actually benefit from when the economy starts to recover is to own assets. And that's why there's so much income inequality. The poorest in society who don't own investments, don't own business shares, don't own property, that's why it's going to take them a decade to recover from this. But actually, even if you have a relatively small share portfolio in an ISA, for example, and the markets then rise in part of the economic recovery, you'll benefit from it. It's too simplistic, as I say, to say that and sort of offer that as a solution. But one way of reducing income inequality is to democratize share ownership, for example, get more people actually owning shares in companies which do well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, at this stage, I think the system is fundamentally broken now. I think that's the problem, because there shouldn't be this level of wealth inequality. Nobody should be a billionaire more than 100 times over. I don't think there's any need for anyone to be a billionaire at all, actually. And I think the way that we now look at society and what we as individuals as well, what we aspire to have, so often that is rooted in money and consumption and having bigger things, faster things, flashier things. And ultimately that, it doesn't drive happiness. I'm sure Jeff Bezos, I'm sure, could buy, well, I know he could buy a supercar if he wanted, a different supercar every single day of the year. And he could drive to the office, the Amazon offices, in a different supercar every single day of the year. Now, would that make him happy? Probably not. I think it is broken that somebody like Jeff Bezos can do that. And yet the people that are generating so much of his wealth, that are these people working in factories and that are practically kind of doing the bare bones of what it is that Amazon does, can barely afford, they can't afford to acquire any assets, can they? They're not going to be invested. They probably don't own their own homes. I don't know how we tackle this problem. I'm not an economist or a philosopher, but I think probably the Nordic states maybe have got some kind of model that I think the world would be a better place if we kind of moved more to that kind of high tax but very good service it feels like a more equal distribution. And they're doing very well for themselves. You know, these are certainly not poor countries. They're not struggling. And they're very, very happy. They're always very high on these happiness indexes. So I've wondered for a while, will this pandemic change our structure of capitalism? And I think probably not at the moment, because the most powerful still have that kind of overriding vote, and with lots of money comes lots of power, which in itself, I could go on and on about this. I mean, that in itself is a huge problem. These people shouldn't have more sway than anybody else, but powerful corporation does. And I mean, I've gone off on a complete tangent now.
Sorry, it's my fault entirely for getting you going. I knew this one would wind you up, Hannah, so it's my fault.
But yeah, completely unfair, needs to be done. No one needs to be a billionaire.
There we go. What a powerful message to end on. Hannah, thank you for joining us again for Talking Money this week. Look forward to seeing you again next week. But yeah, a great set of subjects to discuss again. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.